On day 20, we'll start out in Arlington and drive our car to the Udvar-Hazy Center, which is part of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and then we'll drive up to Gettysburg, where we will look at the battlefield before heading back to the Arlington area. As we head out of our hotel, it's going to be an overcast day, and it'll be raining off and on. The Udvar-Hazy Center is where the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum keep their larger airplanes and aircraft. It had an addition added to it that allows them to have the space shuttle here also. It's located near JFK Airport so that they can land their large aircraft there. It is a huge hangar with many aircraft on the ground and flying through the air overhead. We're just going to look around and see what airplanes they do have. This is the airplane that dropped the first nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. It's now time to head out on the road headed north toward Gettysburg. It doesn't take long for it to start raining fairly heavily, and we'll do it off and on throughout the entire day. We now drive through the small town of Gettysburg, where the battle took place. And at last we've arrived at the Gettysburg National Battlefield.
Continue on Gettysburg National Military Park for a half mile.
There's people there.
You can go around.
Are y'all from Winona?
No.
Kill Michael.
Are you really?
I am.
That's my family. I saw your boy.
Oh,
Half my family's buried in Shiloh Manor.
Our first stop after entering the National Military Park will be the Museum and Vista Center. And then we'll head out to explore the park. The two generals fighting here will be Lee and Meade. Lee has decided to take the war north into Pennsylvania.
Late June, he split his men into groups and sent them all north to Pennsylvania. To the east, Union forces, acting as a buffer between the Confederates and the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., were hot on their heels. Finally, on July 1st, Lee's units began to converge on the Federal forces in the town of Gettysburg. The battle that followed raged for 3 days.
On July 1st, 1863, the armies collided at Gettysburg as the front forces ran into each other. They met west of the city in small group, and soon many others were reinforcing the position as the fighting continued west of the city. Soon the Confederates were pushing the Union forces back and through the city to the east. The Union was eventually pushed out of the city and took up positions at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. Let's look around Gettysburg some where the first fighting took place. As you drive through the city, you'll note that there are some old buildings and new buildings. Some of these buildings were actually here when the battle was fought. At the end of the first day of fighting, the South had pushed the North out of the city, but they had together suffered over 18,000 casualties. The North had a very strong defensive line east of the city. Let's look around this area where the first day of the battle was fought. There'll be hundreds of artillery pieces around the park, and also many monuments. Now let's take a ride down the Confederate line that was established by the end of the first day. This road was actually here during the battle, and you can see the Confederates had a fairly strong position behind this rock wall. Along this road, we'll find many monuments from the various southern states. Now we move to the second day of fighting, and the South will take the offensive. Longstreet and his forces will attack the left of the Union forces around Big Top and Little Round Top. Sickles has moved out of a position and leaving gaps in the line that they hope to exploit. He has moved his forces forward, and as the South attacks, they find gaps.
On the second day of the battle, Robert E. Lee decided to take 20,000 troops under James Longstreet and attack the Union left, and take maybe 5,000 to 10,000 and attack Culp's Hill. But the attack on the Union left flank took place first. The Southerners are going to have to get over there without being seen opposite the Union lines. Ultimately, the Southern line will attack what's called an echelon, where a couple of brigades move in, and then a couple more, and a couple more. And ultimately, Longstreet's men will make fierce attacks. First they'll fight at Devil's Den and Little Round Top, and then onto the wheat field. And then they actually have found a gap in the middle of the Union line, troops that had gone to reinforce some of the fighting in other areas, but the Confederates can't quite push through it.
The battle will be fought in such places as Little Round Top, Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, and Wheatfield. The South gets started late, and so it's almost 3 o'clock before they're able to start the assault, and it's bloody hand-to-hand combat throughout the area. And now we're following the Northern forces route, with Big Round Top being their end of their line. And now at Little Round Top we come to the place where the South almost won the battle. The Union left Little Round Top undefended accidentally, and when Brigadier General Warren stepped out and looked, he realized the situation and immediately sent for forces to protect the area as the South advanced across the area in front of you towards it. It was a race with time, and about 15 minutes separated the Union arriving before. The problem is that because Sickles moved out in front, he pulled the forces here away from Little Round Top, and the South is trying to exploit this by turning the corner here. First they start off fighting at the Wheatfield and find soldiers there, and they slide to the left into Devil's Den, trying to get around the flank of the Union forces, and the fighting was fierce in Devil's Den. Many soldiers died in this area. The South was ultimately unable to turn the north flank and retired for the day. On day 3, General Lee sends Pickett to charge the middle of the Union lines with devastating results. We'll be looking at this area next where that happened. We'll see many monuments and cannons here because this was where the fighting was the heaviest and where the casualties were the highest. This is a view from the Confederate line. Those monuments over there is where they're attacking to, across this open field. And this is the Union's view. Across this field marched a line of soldiers a mile long and 12,000 soldiers strong. They marched from that tree line that you see 3/4 of a mile away. They started with artillery, and then they formed up and marched across the cannons from the south were not very effective against the Union soldiers because of the stone walls, so they were decimated as they marched across the field and climbed the various fences. Smoke covered the battlefield as they marched on. This monument shows the high water mark. This is as close as they came to victory. They fought their way up to and through the Union line, but then outnumbered and low on ammunition, they had to retreat. As the South left the field that day, 6,000 soldiers, half of them that started, lied dead or wounded. And Lee realized that he was going to have to head back south and abandon the invasion of the North. And this brings us to the end of our battle story, but not the story of Gettysburg. For as they decided to bury these people in a new cemetery and invited Abraham Lincoln to come and give an address, we call it the Gettysburg Address.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
And we eventually arrive back in Arlington, and this ends day 20.